Welcome, this is David Benedictus, and welcome to Couve.
Welcome. We're very happy to have you here. I'm Daria Ruggles, and today we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Kat Meow Garcia. Welcome, Kat Meow.
Hi there. I'm the Community Media Advocacy Manager at Open Signal. I also am the board chair of Couve Community Radio, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm really glad to be here in both your companies.
Oh, thank you. We're so happy to have you. And today we wanted to speak with you because we were talking about this idea of juvenile restorative justice. And I know that this is something that both you and David have a lot of experience with. And so we thought, let's talk together about it. So David, can you start us out by just please defining what the heck is restorative justice?
Well, yeah, sure. I began working in restorative justice in 2001 for the Clark County Juvenile Court and learned about it then. Before I hadn't really heard much about that, but really so one of the things I'd like to do is talk basically about what traditional retributive justice is and how, just briefly, and how restorative justice is different than that. So in criminal justice or in retributive justice, it's about crime is an act against the state. So the state holds the power to decide what the sanctions or the accountability is going to be. And it's the threat of punishment is what the state holds against the child, the adolescent. And then the belief is, this is an assumption that is being made. The assumption is that the threat of punishment and then the sanctions deter crime. So that's the assumption in the traditional model. And that the criminal justice system controls how people's response to crime, the community's response to crime. In the restorative model, it's crime is against another person and the community. So there's harms caused to individuals and the community by the crime that needs to be addressed, and that needs to be that healing needs to come in some way, shape, or form. And punishment is not effective by itself, or sanctions aren't effective by itself, and they need to be age appropriate, and sanctions need to be appropriate for the maturational age of the child. And then changing the behavior in the community, you need to focus on relationships, rebuilding the relationships in the community. Use that as an option. Something happened, it caused harm. This is an opportunity to hold the young person accountable in a developmentally appropriate way, and also heal the community at the same time in the broken relationships. So, and just a few more things about that. So accountability is defined by taking punishment in the traditional model, and the offender is defined by the deficits, not strengths. It's about the crime. So you are what you did. And that there's no encouragement for repentance or forgiveness in the traditional model. And in the restorative model, accountability is defined as taking action to repair the harm. So that you're talking about from the very beginning, something happened, you may not even know that you caused harm, or you did, but what you did, graffitiing that guy's fence, or hitting that person, or keying your teacher's car, or whatever impulsively you do, right? And the offender is defined by the capacity to make reparations. So you're defined by the belief in that you are a person, you're a human being, you're more than the crime, and that you can make reparations, you can repair the harm. And then the focus then turns to bringing in the victim in ways that aren't very robust in the traditional model. Victims are usually only contacted if there's restitution, and they don't find out what's going on. They may be asked to write a statement or something like that in serious crime. But most of the time, victims feel very unsatisfied about not being included in the process in the traditional model, the criminal retributive model. But in the evolving restorative justice models, there's a lot of effort to involve victims and to understand what happened for them, what they need to make things right. And sometimes it isn't restitution. Sometimes it's understanding what's going on with the kid. The victims are sometimes concerned about the kid. What's going on with the kid? You know, what's happening with them, and they want them to do something in the community to make up for it. And sometimes in a very specific place, like working in a home, assisted living or something like that, you know, or doing some kind of community service someplace in the community, very specific things. So it's not the criminal model, to sum it up, is more of a passive model, deficit focused, and the restorative model is thinking about developmental age and appropriateness of a child and what they can do to repair harms and how to explain to them the harms that were caused. So you have to have also practitioners in the court system or wherever you refer the case that are skilled at those kind of communication skills.
So that's, thank you, David. So Cat Meow, can you tell us what your experience of juvenile social justice is, how you came into it?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, my first experience with juvenile justice was within my own family. I have a very intelligent older brother, who was criminalized at a really young age because he was not able to concentrate in school. He was really bored. He was reading at a much higher reading level than his peers, and the content that he was being given did not appease. It didn't provide him with extended education, which is what he needed. And so he was kind of labeled as disruptive, having behavioral issues, class clown, all these different things, when really he was just bored out of his mind. And so he ended up, not going to school too often, finding things to get up to in his own in his own way. And we grew up pretty poor as kids. And so one of the first things that he had interaction with the law with was shoplifting, getting toys for the rest of us kids to play with. And so that we had a little bit more normal of a childhood is what, we were thinking as kids, like, oh, yay, toys. Okay. So I saw him being treated really unfairly by prosecuting attorney people in the juvenile court. It was as though they were talking to someone else, not my brother. Really, really harsh, assuming things like that he didn't care about people, assuming that he basically had no emotions, that he was just this cold, hardened criminal. I think the first time with the brush with the law was maybe 12.
Oh.
And it was just bizarre because if you know my brother like I do, and the rest of his community knows him, he's hilarious. He's very loving. He's very warm. He's a father now, extremely kind and caring, loves animals, very talented artist, reads like you wouldn't believe, has extensive eclectic music likes, and so it's just seeing the court system treat, and officers, the law treat my brother in this way, when I was like, wow, I couldn't understand it. And so that was my first brush with it personally. And it really colored the way I viewed juvenile justice, because it didn't seem like there was any justice from that perspective. And as I got older, I started looking into well, how do these systems work? Because they obviously weren't working. My brother kept getting in trouble. And it seemed like the penalties just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And there wasn't any well, why? There was never a why. Why is this happening? Why is this child doing these things? Why is he the one in the class that gets picked on when no one else does? None of these questions were happening. And it was just this weird, it was weird. It was as though the court and the system saw a completely different person than who my brother actually was and who I knew. And as I started studying more and more, I started seeing that this was actually present in the adult justice framework as well, the justice system for adults as well. Started studying more and more, started coming to terms with some things that had happened to me in my childhood, some assault that had happened to me. And I got involved with a group for children who are survivors of assault. And there I got introduced to some youth who had also been in the juvenile justice system as a result of their behavior, as a result of their abuse, of their sexual assault. And so here I am with this like background knowledge of my brother, my background knowledge of like how I dealt with my like childhood assaults, and then watching these new kids that I'm like working with, who are survivors as well, seeing that same pattern repeated, and then noticing the organization that I was working with doing different things, handling behavioral issues in a completely different, almost completely like black and white different way, which was allowing it as long as it's not hurting anyone, allowing behavior to happen. This idea of that youth who are in pain or struggling or in trauma, they know what they need to heal. And as long as it's not harming anyone or any property, to allow that process to happen, to find ways to say yes. And so there's this whole other dynamic that I learned through the Victory Over Childhood Assault, which is VOCA, the Healing Circle camp. I learned through their training a lot about myself too, and a lot about like what I needed as somebody who had survived. And I'm really grateful that I didn't get involved in the juvenile justice system when I was young, because I worry that it would have shaped my vision of myself and what I was capable of. And I seen that in my brother and also in the youth that had started working with the Healing Circle. And so what I started to think about was this idea of restorative juvenile justice instead of this like punishment-based system. And the value in it is not only for the value of the youth, like for their own lives and for their own self-worth, but also there's a value in community building. When you do bring in somebody who's been hurt by someone else, and you bring the person who did the hurt, and then they get to talk and like see each other as human beings for the first time, and then talk about how they can make their community whole again. And it has a lot more of this feeling of like a village or a community, instead of you're a prisoner of the state, you're doing this thing to things. And it just humanizes the whole situation. It allows people to make mistakes and allows them to learn from them instead of just be blinded with punishments, which doesn't really allow for much growth.
No, if anything, it's like what David said, you are defined by your worst actions, and which then traps you in this vicious cycle of continuing that same behavior, because they don't really give you any other models of how to create restitution.
Right. And so there's another way that it's linked in, this restorative justice for youth, with my work at Open Signal. So I started at Open Signal as a volunteer. I would help run our summer camps, right? And I never really wanted to get into public school education because I saw very clear similarities between the way the juvenile justice system works and the way the public school system works, wherein kids are being punished. Their behaviors defining who they are when it really shouldn't. And just a whole other onslaught of things that really crushes creativity and crushes the will to want to be educated, and just puts people in boxes, especially like young people. And so I didn't want to get into that. And so, I had fun volunteering at Open Signal, doing media education there. And I was allowed to utilize different ways of teaching, and it was fully embraced. The programs that we were running got huge. People were sending their kids from all over the city to go to these programs because their kids were coming home reporting having fun and learning at the same time. So it was really great. And we just saw higher and higher numbers. I finally was hired on, and I was able after that to then start implementing the same practices that we used with youth with regards to their behavior and how to have restorative justice in the classroom, even with adults as well. So those really excellent. And we were able to train a bunch of instructors as well on how to think about, what behaviors actually mean and what's behind them, instead of just going for the like stick.
Right, exactly. And they've certainly done studies that children learn from play, and that doesn't end, right? we all still want to have fun and learn from things that we do that bring us pleasure. I mean, what an idea. So
and learn from our mistakes as well.
Right. And not be punished for them or be identified with them so completely. So I'm also really interested to know from both of you, like David, you're both an educator and part of this model. How have you seen this different shift in paradigm of have you seen this working for kids in Clark County?
Well, it's been remarkable. They because first of all, there has to be training of the people that are, as Katmia was talking about. You have to train the people to be able to interact with the kids in a different way and see the bumper sticker I always think of is all behavior has meaning. All behavior has meaning. So you have to wonder. You have to be intellectually curious. Who's this child? What did they experience? Why are they acting in this way, in this setting? And how can I create a relationship with them to understand what will help them? So as Cap Meow was saying, when this approach comes into schools or the juvenile court or mental health systems or child serving agencies, it changes the lens you look at the kid through, and you don't see him as just bad behavior or a bad kid or a kid that the system has given up on. He's never going to be anything, or she's never going to be anything. They're always going to have trouble. I mean, those are things that teachers and probation counselors and child care workers sometimes will say because of their own burnout of being in the trenches and feeling they don't have resources to help people. So there's that too. You also have to take care of the staff in a restorative way. But when you change that mindset, then what happens is you see the whole expression on a staff member change. And rather than having an angry face, they'll have a face that's soft, and they'll have eyes that are looking at soft eyes and are saying, what's going on? What's going on? Rather than coming at them like with the finger pointing and that you did it again and why can't you learn and that kind of thing. Well, what we know from neuroscience is that early childhood trauma changes the ability to learn. It actually changes the brain structure. So you have to the good news is that with good enough resources available, they're using these restorative trauma informed approaches that we now know are what we need to use. And the traditional approach was actually making it worse for kids, is that this creates an environment where they can begin to understand that they have feelings, that it's okay to have the feelings, and that they are more than what they did, more than the behavior they did. And there's a future hope for them. So a lot of these kids carry around a lot of despair, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, right? So this is the antidote to that, is caring adults. How about that? Caring adults make a difference, right? And it also settles the kid down immediately. When they see a soft eye compared to a scowling face, it changes the whole thing, because we're wired for looking at faces and determining that. I mean, we pick that up in 10 seconds, and it goes right to is this person a threat or is this person safe? Kind of thing. It goes right to the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with fear and anxiety. So it's remarkable. You have kids participating more fully. They then participate in accountability meetings. They go out and do community service. So if you have, well, I'm going on and on here, but in Clark County, I was fortunate to be a small part of a really integrated, one of the most integrated restorative justice programs in the United States, and, right here in River City, right? So because not only did they have victim offender meetings, but they had empathy building meetings with the kid, and they did skill set training for them, communication skill set training. And then when they did community service, they sent them out to volunteers that were already doing work in the community, and they worked alongside volunteers. They might have been picking up stuff on the side of the road, but they were all community volunteers like you and me doing that. And so they had a feeling of belonging. And guess what? The volunteers became the kids' mentors. And some of the time after, if there was a face-to-face meeting, like for example, a kid does graffiti on a fence, happens once in a while. So some of these kids are really creative artists. Anyway, they do the meeting with the homeowner, and I mean, when they're sitting there across from them, they can see the homeowner's frustration, but also the feeling of hope for the kid, and that this is an option. They want the best for them, and that they can come over and clean up the fence with supervision, and they do that and they feel good, you know. And so they're not defined by what happened. Or I I mean, it's so applicable in all sorts of conditions. There was a special ed teacher that got assaulted by a kid who was out of control, you know. And special ed kids, they have a range of challenges in terms of controlling impulsivity, right? All the way from autism, ADD, ADHD, uh, all sorts of spectrum disorders, and kids that are traumatized and they just lose it. So this happened. The kid was home for a couple of days, but they met and they talked in my office about what it was like, and they have a beautiful relationship. They had a beautiful relationship going, and the kid no longer feels ashamed and bad. And the teacher gave this wonderful gift to him, was sitting down and saying what it was like, and he talked about what it was like, and they made an agreement about what to do with triggers in the future and stuff like that. It was just a simple thing. It's a simple thing, but that changes the whole mindset of those two people, but also of the whole community that supports those two people. They see this healing that goes on, and they say, geez, that's a good thing, you know?
What do you have to say to those people that say, well, I don't think these hoodlums should be coddled? I mean, that we have to make these people accountable for their behavior. You can see how much I believe in that, but let's play devil's advocate. Does it work? Does it work to do that? I mean, what do you say to those people?
So, well, I've actually been doing trainings on this for a while, and I had, you know, social workers and professional people who were very, you know, lovely, compassionate people say that very thing about accountability, and they were trying to figure out how accountability looked for those kids, and they still held accountable, but the accountability is age appropriate, and it's done in a way that reconnects them with community. So it's still about accountability. It's not about punishment, though. It's about accountability, because accountability is about addressing the individual that was harmed. So it's a different way of thinking about it, and it belongs to the people, supervised by the state representatives, probation counselors. And so there's that piece there that and when you explain that to people, they say, oh, that makes sense. So he went out and did community service at a place where the victim wanted him to do community service, and he came and did an apology, but he didn't apologize right away. He heard first about what happened. So here's an example, just a stupid kid pranks, right? Okay, here's the story. Super Bowl. Years ago, I can't even remember what years it was, but there's some team won and some team lost, and these kids were having a great time, and they were going through a community south of us here, and they had a paintball gun, and they were going along shooting houses or mailboxes, something like that. And it was a red paintball gun, and one of them hit a window of this house, and the people were sitting there watching the game, just finishing up watching the game, and it hit behind them, right? So first there was a thud, and then they looked, and what they saw was red coming down there. So what do you think? Blood, right? So it so happened, and as we all know, is that there's a lot of people out there that have trauma. And so this woman had trauma, and she hit the deck. I mean, she was a trauma survivor. She hit the deck, and she was just paralyzed. But she thought that was blood on the window, and something awful had happened to some other person or something like that. Well, long story short, they finally found who the kid was. She kind of put herself back together and filed a police report and stuff like that. They easily wiped off, but they wanted to talk with the kids and let them know how upsetting that was, and they did that. But and that woman felt better about that. she felt about that because she was able to talk with the kids about it. And the kids did community service, and they learned something, that it was an empathic encounter. Just a simple thing like that.
It puts the humanity back in the equation, you know. When
Yeah, it did. Right.
that it's about the violation to the state, and then not that we want to talk about that here, but then the whole idea of who benefits from that. Like if you look at this from the human perspective and look at taking responsibility versus punishment, especially with this whole idea of privatizing prisons and the whole school to prison pipeline, this cuts right into that.
No, you have the community. The difference is the community state keeps ownership. Even if a kid goes out of the community because, let's say, their home life is really unsafe and they're extremely impulsive, they need to go to a residential facility. You need to have restorative programs in the residential facility, and planning and bridging back into the community where they have the services that they need. The services that Cadmia was talking about, you know, that kind of sensitivity in camps and work with families and things like that.
Well, and something that, like, you hit the nail on the head, or whatever the phrase is, a little bit earlier when you were talking about that mentorship with folks working along the side of the road with youth who are involved in some sort of like criminal, you know, behavior or whatever. It's the sense of belonging. That's a huge difference than the punitive kind of old school way of dealing with youth and their behavioral issues. When you have a youth who has behavioral issues, there are very few true psychopaths out there. There really truly are very few. The trouble with the way the behavioral issues have been looked at before is that there's this like immediate labeling that, oh, they're just like, they're uncaring, unfeeling, all these things. But the truth is most youth want to belong to something.
Oh yeah.
And when you create an arena for belonging and you include them, like, no, you may have stole, you may have graffitied, you may have accidentally hurt someone physically, but you belong here. And how can we make it so that you feel like you belong here and that you feel better about this situation, whatever your behaviors have done or whatever has come about because of some negative behavior? How can we make this feel like you belong? Because when you belong to a community, you don't want to disrupt and harm your community. You'll still have accidents and make mistakes, but the more that people feel like they belong to the community that we're trying to keep safe, the more they're going to take care and nurture and be stewards of their own community, is the truth.
Right. And it seems to me that the direct line there is separating who you are from your behavior, which is also the difference between like the belonging thing versus fitting in. If you're treating someone like who they are is their behavior, and you're saying you don't belong, and then they feel they never fit in, which is a reason why you would want to denigrate a system that basically completely vilifies you. And
well, recidivism happens then too. You continue to, you don't belong in this community anyway. Where do you even belong? So it's a downward spiral when you don't have that open arena to like bring people back in and create that sense of belonging. Because if you're not part of the community, then what do you care? You know?
Well, that makes me think about why kids join gangs, stuff like that. It's a sense of belonging. And from the psychology perspective, neurosciences, we're hardwired for relationships, and we need to be seen. We need to have people looking at us in hopefully a loving, adoring way at the right times, right? As much as we need that when we're growing up, right? And we need to see other people, right? So to see and be seen, and that's the idea of the restorative part of it. Is you're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're feeling it. It's a very visceral, empathic encounter, and it is much more. It takes time. It takes time to set that up. You need to meet with people individually beforehand, understand what their needs are, both the victim and the offender. And sometimes it means having more people at the table for the youth at risk offender to feel supported to go through with a meeting. There's a power differential there, and that's fine. And by the way, we've been doing this for a long time. All indigenous communities have this approach. Native Americans, the Maori, New Zealand, African. In small indigenous communities, it was all about repairing the harms and people making amends. So it's old, what is it? Ancient knowledge seeking new minds. That's that Wendell Berry line. So we're trying to infuse the humanity back into the accountability, people taking accountability in the juvenile justice system, and in some cases in the adult system too.
And to speak to Daria, to your question about, the privatization of these prisons, and this approach doesn't benefit privatized prisons at all.
Oh, no.
Because what it does is it keeps young people in the community, and it keeps them functioning and turning into great adults and finding their best potential in themselves and in their community. And instead of, being funneled into these like prisons. So
well, the privatization, right? The privatization was all about cost savings for the individual states and communities and stuff. And it doesn't work, and it doesn't cost that much less. Well, actually, it does cost less because they shortchange the inmates there, the incarcerated people, on food and on access to healthcare products and things like healthcare.
So, I mean, it sets up a terrible precedent. I mean, I wasn't there a judge that was held accountable?
Oh, he was a bad man. That was a bad dude. Yeah, he was he was getting kickbacks from the private residential facility, some place down south. Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Yeah.
He had a financial incentive for sending these kids we're talking about. Some of them, like, I think that the way that it happened, if either of you know about this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something like there was a mother who wanted, it's so sad, that whole tough love thing. I'd love to talk about how we can create more of a paradigm of what the two of you know, and how we can start making that, how we can advocate for that as citizens. But she thought the best thing to do would be to take her bad little boy who did whatever he did, some minor infraction. And so she wanted him to go to jail so he could see what it's like. And so she, he would learn his lesson.
Scared straight.
Scared straight, exactly. And instead, tough love. And instead what happened was he was under the auspices of this judge who sent him, to a work prison or whatever. And then, she couldn't get him out. She didn't have a lot of money. And it devolved into this horror story for her. And I think, I'm not sure if that's even the same judge. The part of me that wants a happy ending wants to believe that it was that person and that judge, and the kid got out, and the judge was held accountable for his egregious acts.
I think the judge went to prison. Which but going back to the private. So what happens is this privatization is really insidious, though. We have to stop it. Because what they then take that money and lobby with Congress to create more private prisons, private probations, and they tack on huge fees. That this was all about what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri, because they were just pulling people over and tacking on fees, and then they were tacking on the fees for not paying the fees, and people could never get out of debt, and then they would be arrested and put in jail because they weren't paying the fees. And
debtor's prison, like all over again.
We do have debtor's prisons, right?
Yeah.
So what state? Ohio just did away with cash bail. I think it was Ohio, maybe. So that's the debtor prison kind of. If you don't have, you go to jail. If you can't pay cash, then you go to jail. And people would sit in there for 3 months, unadjudicated.
And that's supposed to be called penury, and also
Yeah.
Eighth Amendment too, cruel and unusual punishment. So, Katmi, I remember you telling me that you knew about a program. Was it in Denver? Can you tell us a little bit about that program?
Oh, so Denver took and had, in light of like the civil rights protests and everything that happened in 2020, they initiated a program about 6 months ago that was an alternative to sending the police to mental health calls, wellness check calls, your random person in the street screaming call, right? Which, if you haven't screamed in the street, open up your heart because you might one day.
Right.
Might one day, and you're going to want somebody who cares about you to come and help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they initiated this program where social workers were sent, and I believe there may have been an officer, but they're completely unarmed, not even like pepper spray or anything, to kind of suss out the situation. And so most of the time they were offering people water, food, rides places, help getting medical care that was desperately needed, help getting away from domestic violence situations, out of prostitution, out of just off the streets and somewhere warm for a night to just sleep. And most of the calls were people literally, their needs weren't being met. They like ran out of their meds and they don't even know who they are right now because they can't, get access. And it was just, they would have the person come in the van, sit down, talk to them, find out what their needs are, get them to where they need to go. And out of like all the calls, thousands and thousands and thousands of calls, there were like there were zero that needed the police. Zero.
So zero arrests?
Zero arrests, because for all those thousands of people that likely would have been arrested if the police came, or worse, killed, let's be real, real serious. No one died and no one was put in jail. People were placed in different areas and given the resources they needed, or at least put in a pathway towards those resources, and talked to like one-on-one with another human being. No cuffs, no weapons, just a lot of times water and some sandwiches. And that's astounding to know that usually the police would have been addressing those issues and concerns. Usually when you call, there's a man outside screaming, they would send the police. But in Detroit, or Denver rather, they were sending this team. I think it's called the STAR team. And I believe that Portland's trying to get something started like that as well soon.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
I'm excited about that. Because there are a lot of people there's a lot of really talented, amazing, creative people in the Portland metro area. And with talent and artistry and creativity comes the other side, which is sorrow and depression and troubles. So there's a lot of people suffering here. We have a large houseless population, and thinking that they might be getting like someone to talk to and someone who can help them find resources instead of like some dude in a uniform with a gun is like, it's an amazing thought that could possibly happen here. So,
and the idea that it's amazing is deeply disturbing on some level. It's like vilifying the most vulnerable, penalizing the most vulnerable. And we've talked about this too a little bit, this idea that you are forever tainted. I don't know if it's of all places, I think it's Russia, where if once you've like served your time, they give you money, they give you a new address, and your debt to society, whatever that is paid, and you go off and you get to have your dignity back. And it feels like the punitive aspect and the vilification of this, even people who haven't actually trespassed against the law. If you're out in the street screaming, other than disturbing the peace, what and what's the difference between that and really loud music? Maybe that person's just expressing their true emotions and doing it in a musical way.
It's disturbing the flow of capitalism. It's disturbing the flow of capital to the owning class, and that's a whole other show that I would love to be on.
Yes. Oh, yes. And we'll have you. And these things weave together so well, that's why it's like we have to sort of parcel it out. So I'd love to know from both of you, how can we best articulate the difference between, this retribution versus restorative, and how we can advocate for it?
Well, the way that we did it here, actually, the way it's being done throughout the Pacific Northwest now, but the way I learned about it was working at the juvenile court, was to involve policymakers, judges, prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys at that level, and guess what? They know the system's broken and it ain't working. They know it. And it's and when you present this idea that we want the kid to be accountable, but also developmentally have the accountability developmentally appropriate to the child, not isolate them, in other words, the detention, but rather build up, use that as an opportunity to build up so a community that can support them in their home rather than sending them to detention. So in Clark County, they developed, in other communities, they developed an alternative to detention, which involves mental health teams and stuff like that. And then if you have kids with a diagnosed, what they call an Axis 1 diagnosis, mental health illness, that's struggling with using the regular institutions, the schools and regular services, they have a special team of mental health specialists that work with that family. It's called a wraparound approach. So they look at what formal services need to be involved. They bring them to the table with the informal family, community, friends, pastor, neighbor, whoever. And they all sit down and they talk about what the needs are. And the formal services are involved first to stabilize things, mental health treatment, mentors, camps, outings, whatever. And then the informal services come behind and pick it up and replicate that plan. So that's a big thing. And so, but I just wanted to mention that the Denver program, I think, is also adults. And that goes to what we need to talk about is community policing and how to reimagine community safety policing. That's a whole big issue. And that's on the top 10 list here on the side to get to. But all these things work in the community, and it's about conflict resolution skills. You give officers conflict resolution skills, and they're actually, we did it here in Vancouver and over in Portland. And you've got to look then at your staff and say, are they people that this is going to take with? I mean, are they going to learn this process and give them time to do that or not, and then show them the door? Because we don't want that kind of approach in our community. We don't want people being abused, beat up, set up, and we want it a safe community, but we also want people to be treated reasonably and humanely, given that we know what we know now, which is from all the social science and neuroscience and trauma research. Yeah, as Kat was saying, most of the kids in the juvenile court have some kind of trauma history. We actually did a study of that I can talk about some other time.
Okay. But you make me think too, and I know that you're both aware of this idea that that we don't teach kids this, even though I think Daniel Goleman wrote the book, and he wrote the book based on a paper that was written, this concept of emotional intelligence and being able to understand what you're feeling, especially when you're a kid, right? I mean, the whole, David, you know about this one so well, that kids are not small adults and they're not babies either, and their frontal cortex isn't developed yet, and so the idea when they need it the most, that they instead it goes to what you were saying earlier, Katniel. They want to make good cogs in the wheel of capitalism. They just want to teach them the things that will make them good workers. But the reality is that this makes you a wholer human, which makes you a better everything, including worker. And I was reading this book called Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. And he's actually designed something, and I think the acronym is RULER, and I can't remember what it stands for, but it's all about teaching this emotional intelligence to kids in school as part of the curricula. And that it's about being an emotional scientist. So being able to create this sense of objectivity as you're studying your own emotions, and that you're working with these adults in order to do that.
Yeah, I think definitely, like what David was talking about, working within the system to impact different policies and training is a way to get the ball rolling. I do, though, I am kind of a radical, as you both may know, and I do have to say that when I hear people say, or when I hear the phrase "the system is broken," I get little feelers pop up, and I have to say it's not actually broken. It was built and designed to be this way, to really take from our communities the most brilliant minds and put them in jails. It was built to make profit
for the wealthy and to keep us working class and poverty stricken folks much lower so that we never raise to what we could be, which is, you know, all these people being put in jails could really, those could be the minds that are giving us our like amazing scientific discoveries and our amazing healers that we're not seeing, you know, right now, because so many of the population are in jail, and it does start fairly young now. And so I think another way that, you know, that we can start to approach change is to recognize that reality and to say, what can we do instead?
Right.
What can we do instead? And I think, yeah, some policies and stuff can help. I do think that there have been people imploring that police departments, especially in Portland, do more training, and they say they do the training, but there's not a real significant change. And so I think that these steps towards, all right, this isn't your responsibility anymore, just taking it off the plate. You don't get to do this anymore. We're going to find a different way to interact with our youth and our even in having these struggles. I think it's a new way, and I'm more interested in a new way than I am with like, let's just try the old school way of like going to the commissioner. And I value the work that people have done for that. That's not to say I don't value it, but what I'm seeing is that our police union is so strong that these changes aren't taking hold. And from what I'm hearing from community, when you have someone else in community that's not a police officer who's trying to help you, that it's a lot easier when there's not that uniform in the way. Because unfortunately, there's 400 years of this being like us versus them. Like, I'm afraid of them. Like, there's a huge power dynamic. But when it's someone with a sandwich and a cup of water and like, hey, what's going on with you? I really want to know. Like, that's it's a whole other dynamic. And I think that we're finding that it's working better. So I'm excited about these new systems. I'm also excited about community building that I've been seeing, like with the Voga Healing Circle, offering these resources outside of the like legal system to support any changes that do eventually come with the hard work of folks who are in that legalese talk and all the bureaucracy of it. Because anything we can do to support the communities we want to see is going to be beneficial. So I wanted to add that part.
I think that's absolutely beautiful. And of course, David and I certainly agree with you in terms of this. This is again why it's such a huge issue. It's like it's a tiny issue, and it's also a huge issue. It's an individual issue, and it's a community and a country issue, which this is the reason why we're examining systemic racism, because this country was set up that way. It was created that way, and it was set up that way. And this whole idea of law and order, the electoral college and the appeasement to the slave states. I mean, there's a connectivity line of truth through all of this.
Yeah, the old bumper sticker, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, everything's a nail, right? So that's, and you hit it, you keep pounding it, you're not getting it, hits you harder. But now we know that doesn't work with human beings. And in terms of the policymakers, what I wanted to say about that is that what we're trying to get them to do is to let go, like you were saying, Katmio, let go of that and let someone else do it and send the money after it, right? So you put the money in the schools, you put mental health treatment in the schools, you put it in the jails, and you have people treated there and worked on there. So if someone does get picked up, I worked in coordinating mental health services for Clark County for about 4 years for Medicaid population. And, people would be out there hollering on the streets, and then they go to jail, they get out, and then they'd use substances or get intoxicated and show up in the ER. So they're high utilizers. So what do we do with them, right? So it's just a revolving door, and you have to encounter them in a different way. And the other thing is that we need to look at what kind of treatment we're using for people. Is it evidence-based treatment? The stuff we're doing, that we've been doing for years, all the research I've seen is that the drug and alcohol programs without mental health is not not useful. And then the short-term approach with using mostly support group afterwards is not very helpful either. It doesn't seem to have much evidence of helping. Well, it helps about 5% of the people basically, but that's where drug and alcohol treatment stops because of our or the way we look at it. You don't have willpower, you're morally irresponsible. So we judge people and don't understand that it's a neurological brain science issue. Why people are drinking.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, I know I find it frightening that, remember, I mean, certainly when we were kids, the typical cop that you would see in, films or whatever, he was an Irish guy, Officer O'Malley. He was a peace officer. And now we have these militarized domestic military. They're militarized. They're wearing all of this stuff. In Vancouver, they brought a big SWAT machine. It's like, what are you using those for?
Well, we got it for free from the federal government.
Wow. And why?
Well, yeah, the Olympia, Washington Police Department, they built this huge complex. Olympia, by the way, for viewer, it's this tiny little hippy dippy town on the along the peninsula of the inlet there. It's the sea capital, right? It's a tiny little town. It's a college town. They built this huge cop station. It looks like something from RoboCop. They even call it the RoboCop station now. And it's just like the insane amount of money that's being spent for this like really like SWAT military looking like facility. It's out of this world. It feels like we're living in a comic book sometimes, but that's capital, that's money that's being spent that could be being spent to make better the lives of those who are suffering around us, including youth, right? Because half of the population is women and children that's without homes right now. And bringing them up, instead of bringing them up, we're building these like buying weapons and building these giant buildings. And it's just.
Yeah, right. And the truth of the matter is helping those people is helping us.
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, you can't, Robert Anda, who's a Center for Disease Control physician, he wrote a paper analyzing the budget implications of doing early childhood intervention, looking at the trauma load that people carry and focusing on that, and early interventions, wraparound teams, robust mental health programming, alternatives to incarceration, all that stuff. And what he says is we can't intervene our way out of it. You can't throw enough money at it. You have to start with you have to start with prenatal intervention, early childhood intervention, robust support in the school system, in preschools and the school system, identify family needs, and celebrate and truly support families in the way that the unmet needs that they have. That's the answer to that.
I would argue we can't shoot our way out of it either.
Shoot our way
out of it. They want to keep on creating more militarization, more guns, more. So
yeah, that would be the wrong answer.
Exactly. And therefore, the argument to all is that we are safer when we care for each other. That is what
absolutely
is creating a sense of belonging, creating opportunities for belonging to community, and instead of this endless cycle of punishment, which only benefits a very small percentage of people, maybe gun manufacturers and 1% of the 1%. Certainly it does not benefit, it's been proven, it does not benefit, and it's even true right on a national level. We are not safer by having more guns.
You think?
Right, it's not our opinion. That's the thing. It's a fact.
There's a really good article by the Children's Defense Fund. They have the unfortunate of leave no child behind as one of their quotes on their page, but I don't think they're referring to that policy from way back when. But it's talking about why investing in education is actually better for our communities than incarceration. It's a really good article. I put it in the chat.
Okay, good. I'll
We'll
link.
tag that on the end of the program on the resource card. Yeah, that's, thank you, Kat. That's so important. I mean, so when I think about that resource and those studies, Kat Meow and Daria, I think, so here is our dilemma. We know what works and what helps people at this point. And we have to have the political will and whatever community effort it takes to say, this is not how we want our money spent. And that's why, by the way, we were out on the streets all last summer, is because we don't want the money spent this way.
Right.
We do not want it spent on weapons of mass destruction. We don't want it spent on destroying our communities by these draconian laws that separate families and pit people against each other and make us.
Yeah, we don't want to build more prisons. We've got plenty.
Yeah.
Got plenty.
Mhm.
I got too many of those.
More than any other industrialized nation.
Right. And don't we incarcerate more people than any other industrialized nation?
Yep.
More women as well. We're up there. Yeah, we're number one.
And nor do we, just to go to Kat Meow's thought, absolutely. We do not want to be trapped by a toxic system. And however that system has to be reinformed, you know, I don't stand for necessarily for anarchy, but I certainly want to challenge a system that the nuts and bolts of which were built on the bodies and minds of human beings that are that would be part of the creative and beautiful identification of possibilities instead of being treated as criminals and dismissed and thrown away and locking the key and locking away the key.
Just to make a commercial, the Northwest Justice Forum that's been meeting for 15 years has started looking, in addition at juvenile restorative justice, they began looking at how to support people in prisons and who are incarcerated and coming out of prison. I had the chance to be part of a 7-month group that I co-facilitated with the chaplain down at Oregon State Penitentiary that came out of this restorative justice work. We're talking about, okay, we got juvenile justice, and we also want to look at adults because they need a bridge coming out. And what you, going back to your comment about the Russian system, which surprises the hell out of me. I mean, you think that they sent to Siberia if they survived the radiological poisoning they got, right? But in any case, that what works is what they started doing in Oregon and Washington was looking at using the conflict resolution centers, those people as hubs in the community that could bridge out, that go in and start preparing people for coming out and bridge them out into some kind of community resources out there. And so the group of guys that we're meeting with were 10 of them, and they thought that was a great idea, and they were really interested in. These are guys that have been in a long time that we were talking with, but their histories were like, you know, that you would imagine. They had rough upbringings. They had absent parents, very traumatizing situations, and they continued to act out in dangerous ways until the community decided that they needed to be there. For the community to be safe. So when we keep damaging people and expecting them to take care of themselves, that is an existential nightmare. You're just going to keep repeating the same thing over and over again.
From Siberia to Chernobyl and back again.
Right. Or you know, I think about those. I watch these YouTube videos on dogs that are adopted, that were abused and stuff like that, and how they, you know, they show them before and after they're picked up, and then they brought home, and they have a loving, nurturing family, and they're really anxious and upset and kind of have a lot of startle response and bark and stuff. But after a while, being cared for and loved and nurtured, all of that hyperarousal, and they rewire their brain systems just like human beings can do, and they feel loved and supported, and and then they're no longer at risk for biting people or running away or any of that stuff, or acting out in a crazy way. Human beings are the same way. If we can do that for dogs, for goodness sake, geez.
One of the saddest things that to talk to exactly what you're talking about is I found that humans, for some reason, can find more empathy, which is different than sympathy, right?
Interesting, yeah.
Animals than they can for their fellow humans sometimes. And I'm really interested in taking the perspective of like a dog who was abused or a cat or, and using it as a metaphor for like a film about juvenile restorative justice,
exactly,
but not let the watcher in on it until the end.
Oh, that's good.
Because then they'll have to face that I felt all this love and care for this animal, but when it's a human being, I don't have that. There are these things that come up, these barriers that come up to feeling that empathy.
Yeah, that would be interesting to explore, Cammy. I think that's something to take a look at. What is it about human beings that they can have that bipolar, that dichotomy there, that they give up on their human beings, but if there was an animal, then they feel the vulnerability and the
well, there's not $1 billion, there's not $1 billion enterprise that's like imprisoning dogs is why. So we're not, because we're raised thinking in a specific way about jails and criminals and what that means. And it's coded language.
Yeah.
But as a child growing up, you don't know that. And a lot of people as adults growing up don't know that.
What is
creating the other, right? Oh, excuse me. Go ahead, David.
Well, I wanted to understand what you meant by coded language. I think I know what it means, but
yeah, there's a classic black and white footage of I believe it's some sort of Republican like political official talking about the word criminal and like what that actually means is brown and black and poor people. But they were using the word criminal to pass policies that were like tough on crime. But what that means is urban people, right? It means people who have black, brown skin or who are poverty stricken or living in poverty. And so using that word criminal and criminalizing basically poverty or skin color is a real thing that was like planned that folks were trying to do back when stuff was in black and white. And you can see that the repercussions of that language today. And I think that like, especially young people don't, honestly, like there's not time to really consider that when you're growing up in it. But when you look back on it, oh, wow. Yeah. All these things that are being said, well, we want to be tough on crime. Well, what do you mean? You mean you want to be tough on brown and black kids and poor kids? Is that what you mean? Because that's what happened. So there's this like weird coding of that language surrounding prisons and jails that you wouldn't hear about being used on a poor little dog who like.
Or people don't necessarily speak out in open. It reminds me of the program we did on legalization of cannabis and how that there was a commission back in the 70s commissioned by Nixon, and they were looking at that as an issue. They were tough because they got elected on tough on crime. And so they was casting around and they said, well, what about, these drugs and stuff. So they created the Schaefer Commission, got a conservative governor to look at it. And they got all these public health people, and they studied it for months. And they came back and said, well, we don't really see it as a community issue, not a problem. Cannabis, that was, marijuana. And then there was, Nixon famously taped all his meetings, right? And on that, they were saying, well, okay, yeah, he says that, but I don't give a damn about that, because it's the black and brown people, all those people, and those Jews, and those psychiatrists, right? So there's the coded language, right? And then it was I can't remember, Israeli historian Yavak Noah something. I always have difficulty with his name. His book *Sapiens*, he talks about the history of moral disgust and how people are seen as unclean, and contaminated. So this is the language that we're hearing, is the contamination of that people live in poverty or brown or other skin are contaminants to the community. And wired in, unfortunately, to our nervous system, and we have to have community that help us see each other as human beings, and not pseudo species that were from another species, you know.
Or an inside group versus an outside.
Yeah, inside versus
Or
outside.
Yeah.
The other, right.
Which actually, you know, we were talking about this briefly today, actually, this, which is a whole other idea, but it's just very interesting to me that, you know, a lot of people were doing that, the ancestry thing, the DNA testing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they were finding out because, right, biologically speaking, there is no such thing as race. There's a spectrum of melanin, which is your skin color. There are all these different aspects, but there's no such thing as race. And then when I remember they had like a commercial or something where that showed people looking at their results, their DNA, and finding out, oh, I'm 22% sub-Saharan African and I have red hair and super white skin. And so this group of strangers, of multicolored people, discovered that they actually, many of them that didn't look anything alike, were actually had the same genetics, the same DNA, the same am I using the right term when I say that they had very, very similar makeup, even though they looked completely different. And it takes the other and makes them not the other and part of the same group of human beings. And I don't know, maybe that was such a unintended solving for prejudice that it got taken away, because I don't hear people talking about it anymore.
Oh, they still do that. I took a DNA class a couple years ago, and they still have those markers on it, and it's often very surprising to people. But that goes to cognitive bias and how you see people, and the social science on cognitive bias is you can't do it in a training. You can't do it in one training. What you have to do is have people working together who are from different backgrounds and different perspectives, different cultures. That's how it happens. Or even better, going to school together.
Right, little kids
From the very beginning. So the other becomes, there's still another, but it's mean people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But
and also eating together, right?
eating together is
Breaking bread is key.
breaking bad, huge thing.
Cafe was that thing in New York City, and I wanted to do it at the library. So Conflict Cafe, I think it was New York City, and they were serving food, but the catch was it was only from countries that we were currently in conflict with.
Oh, interesting.
And while people were getting this food, they were hearing about all of these elements of this country and how culturally it was alike, so that they were disabled from being able to call them the other while they were eating this delicious food, which brings us together. And I think even biologically speaking, they've done some tests about that you create these bonds with people you eat with. Like
it's interesting you brought that up, because at the Healing Circle, the VOCA camps for the survivors, eating the meals together is a huge part of that camp. We do singing at mealtime. We do showing off the crafts that we made at mealtime, and everyone comes to mealtime. You don't have to eat if you don't want to. You can sit or be under the table with your buddy or whatever, but everybody comes to the one cabin to have a meal together. And it does help with healing if you're eating with a group. And maybe it taps into that like lizard brain deep in there. But there's protection when you're eating together. You're being fed, so you're being nourished, and there's protection. There's people all around, and you belong in there, right? So it's very intentional that we have eating together as a huge deal.
Well, this has been so great. I love this. So, you know, I just want to know if either of you have any final thoughts on this idea of restorative justice. It's certainly been wonderful to be with you both, and I thank you so much. Got any final thoughts?
Well, I'll go first. It's not a way to save money. It's a way to save people.
Ooh, bam.
bam. So it eventually does, because it reduces harm and eventually reduces recidivism, but upfront it's about saving people. So and sometimes it costs a little bit more to do that.
And I guess I would say, I totally agree with that. I would say that I would encourage viewers to, the next time that you encounter someone that makes you uncomfortable for whatever reason, you take a deep breath and you think about whether the next statement or move you're going to make is going to help lift that person up, or if it's going to bring them down. Because ultimately, we're here to help each other, and we're here to make the world a better place. And if you're encountering people with that mindset, you're going to find that your community starts to thrive all around you, because you're putting out good energy and you're looking for the value in people, which isn't equated to their ability level or their neurodiversity or their looks or their background. It's equated to something that's deep inside them, that's their gift to share. And every single person has something that is really cool that they can share. And the more you look to lift up, the more you're going to see those really cool gifts, and you will benefit from those amazing gifts. It could be anything from like painting to storytelling to singing to cooking to doing your taxes, all the things. It's within lots of people, and you don't know it from looking at them. You can only tell your own biases towards someone from looking at them. So I would say to keep that in mind, to think about if you're lifting up or if you're holding down.
The power of kindness.
Hey.
Oh, well,
Beautiful. Nice cat.
Yeah.
Nice cat, meow.
We thank you so much. Kat Meow is our community media advocacy manager at our local station, Open Signal. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being such a big part of what makes community good.
What a great resource to have in the community.
Thank you both for having me. I love talking with you both. It's a pleasure every single time.
Well, we have to do a show on your program. I mean, on what services you offer at Open Signal.
Yeah.
So many other things. So many.
Yes.
Many
Things.
things.
Many things.
All
So,
great things.
yeah, community access programming, people making their own
Independent media.
Independent media. There you go. Right. So, thank you for watching. Stay curious in the Couve, and we'll see you next time, and we'll come back to some of these topics and take a deeper dive.
Yeah, and don't call us Vantucky, please.
Oh no, yeah, Kentucky. Oh wow. Yeah, bye. We'll see.